In Canada, most of us never think twice about the accessibility of good healthcare. In fact, we celebrate our system of public healthcare to the point that it's become embedded in our values. It's who we are. But today, there are over 30,000 Canadians experiencing homelessness on any given night, often living with complex health and drug addiction issues, unable to access traditional medical care. Yet they have urgent need, mainly because of the terror of the opioid crisis. That's why our presenting sponsor, TELUS, has developed their Health for Good program and mobile health clinics, specially equipped clinics on wheels providing care and support to our most vulnerable communities. Let me tell you the story of Heidi Morrison. 4 years ago, Heidi was volunteering at a safe injection site in Kitchener-Waterloo, seeing the trauma up close. That single, sobering experience led to the greatest gift of her life, a loving and respectful relationship with her eldest daughter, who had been battling her own opioid addiction for almost 20 years. To this day, Heidi continues to volunteer her time with a mobile health clinic powered by TELUS Health, delivering much-needed supports to individuals who experience real barriers to healthcare, mental health, substance abuse, homelessness, and stigma. It's been through this work, Heidi says, that she learned that addiction is just one small part of who her daughter is. She's also funny, resourceful, kind, humble, and even heroic, having reversed suspected opioid overdosing for almost 50 people in her community by properly administering Narcan. To learn more about the TELUS Health for Good program, go to connectingcanadaforgood.ca. All right, folks, we're back with the Herle Burly this week. Before I introduce my special guest today, I just want to say that this edition of the podcast is being recorded 4 days before Super Bowl 54, in which the Kansas City Chiefs will go on to annihilate the San Francisco 49ers by, probably more than 2 touchdowns. I say this for 2 reasons. First, because I'm a football oracle and unusually gifted in predicting football games. And secondly, because Scott Reed will listen to this podcast, probably wearing that same 49ers jersey he wore last week and has been wearing for a week now, and I'll have made him angry. And right this second, he's talking shit about me right out loud. Let's face it, there's nothing Scott Reed won't verbalize, and that vein is bulging on the right side of his forehead, just like it always does when Scott gets mad. And nothing gives me a sweeter feeling than that. So Scott, go Chiefs. All right, today on the pod, I am thrilled to welcome John Stackhouse. I've known John for many years, and he spent close to 25 years at the Globe and Mail, which is where I came to know him, first as a foreign correspondent, then as editor of the Report on Business, and then finally editor-in-chief at the newspaper. Today, he's a senior vice president, Office of the CEO at the Royal Bank of Canada, where he advises leadership on emerging trends in the Canadian economy, with a particular focus on technological change and innovation in this age of disruption. That sounds like you get paid to sit around and think smart things. What a great job. I would love to have that job. Before anybody thinks that he's just a business guy who's not going to have an interesting opinion for all of us, he's a really complex guy who, as a journalist, really focused on poverty and wrote some landmark journalistic pieces for the Globe and Mail and a fantastic book about the roots and potential remediation of poverty throughout the world. He's the author of 3 books in total, with a 4th coming out in April. Today, we're going to talk about, John has just come back from Davos, and we're going to talk about Davos, and we're going to talk about the business community and what role it's playing, positively or negatively, and can play in addressing the great problems of the world. John Stackhouse, welcome to the Herle Burly.
Thanks, David. I mean, with that setup, this can only go downhill. So let's just wrap up now.
You were telling me that you do a good John Bonham impersonation on the drum set here. So if this goes bad, we'll resort to that. I'll play Wipeout. You can play Led Zeppelin. You just came back from Davos, and can you just give us a little bit of a primer? What is it? What is it? What is this conference summit we hear about?
Yeah. Davos it's a crazy, unique thing as well as place that's unlike anything else I've come across internationally. It is full of stereotypes. It gets lampooned. It's also the only place. It's called the World Economic Forum, and it's the only place, the only time of the year where you get a true kind of intersection of government leaders, of business leaders, of serious environmentalists, climate activists, poverty activists, people from east, west, north, south, 3,000 of them locked inside this little poor little Swiss town that gets invaded every year, except they're not poor because they all rent out their places for obscene amounts and go off to the French Riviera for the week. But it is genuinely a unique few days for people from different parts of the world, different sectors to come together and talk about the state of the world.
How do you get selected to go?
There's a range from people and organizations that pay to go to governments, some of them that pay, some that get invited. A lot of the community activists go for free. They get invited. They go as speakers. There's also kind of layers or rings of Davos where like there's the center part that not everyone gets into, and then outside a certain security perimeter, there's lots of NGOs and community groups that sometimes is more interesting than what you see going on inside the center. So there's kind of layers to the place, and then lots of media that shine a light on it as well.
Tons of government stuff, right? I know when I was in Ottawa, it used to be a bit unseemly the way people would scramble to get a pass to get an invitation to Davos.
Well, some governments love it.
Minister to
some governments revere it, and some really despise it. So it's interesting to see how different governments view it.
Where does the Canadian government fit in that?
The current Canadian government?
Yeah.
I think they've been more enthusiastic. The Trudeau government has been more enthusiastic.
He went personally, right?
He went and made a big mark in his first couple of years.
Yeah.
They've pulled back, partly, I think, because of the minority situation, and you got to stay closer to home. It was interesting this year, I think only 2 of the G7 leaders went. So Boris Johnson didn't go, for instance, and he's the kind of person who would probably enjoy it. But I think he felt, given that Brexit Day is imminent, but also it wouldn't play well with Brexiteers. He not only didn't go, but prohibited most of his ministers from going. Their equivalent of the finance minister went, but Macron also didn't go, and he used to be a Davos regular. So it may be viewed a little more suspiciously
in this populist era.
Exactly.
Probably not seen as the right company to be keeping by a lot of politicians. Merkel went, but she's leaving office.
She went, and this is the value of Davos. She gave, I thought, an extraordinary speech about the transformation that is just beginning of the European economy, the green transformation. And she laid out what Europe's economy can look like over the next quarter century through a complete reimagination and re-engineering to eventually a net zero economy.
Right.
It's extraordinary to me to listen to a G7 leader sort of lay out that vision. That's the value of Davos. You've got people from all over the world who get to hear that and maybe think about how they might apply the same thinking in different ways in their own communities.
Right. So other than government leaders, the people who mostly make the news out of Davos are business leaders who make the news either for saying something characteristically self-interested and therefore mockable, or for saying something unusually enlightened and therefore analyzable. Let's put it that way.
You present this as an either or, David. You don't think
that's right.
Both are possible.
Why do the business leaders go? What do they want to get out of it?
So there's the platform, undoubtedly. A lot of that media profile I mentioned is there. But the real advantage, I think, for business leaders is the opportunity to meet and talk to other business leaders in a contained environment. Within 72 hours, you can get through scores of meetings with people from around the world who you either would have to circle the world to meet, or you might not even get to meet. There's the serendipitous meetings. You bump into people in the hallways, or you go to, there's these things called industry forums where the oil and gas industry or the banking industry will get together. And that's a chance for a CEO from those industries to sit down with their peers. And they bring outsiders in, including activists and critics, and try to have a healthy debate about some of the issues that they may be wrestling with through the year.
There's a business columnist named Kevin Carmichael at The Post who, based on a podcast we did with Michael McCain, wrote a column about where is the business community in the great public affairs debates of Canada, and particularly in the context of the election campaign that was imminent at that point. Where is the business community in the election? And we can talk a little bit later about whether or not they're prominent, but why are these leaders prepared to say things in Davos or discuss issues in Davos that they're not prepared to talk about in the same way in their home country where these things are actually being debated?
I think that's a great question, David. And you and I have been wrestling and arguing about this for years. Canadian business leaders, and this is a generalization, tend to be less publicly oriented in speaking about issues outside of their business, certainly than you see in Europe. Certainly more or less, you see them or hear them less vocally here than a lot of their American counterparts. I think part of that is just the Canadian way. And part of that is the nature of Canadian business. It's also cyclical. There are times when business is less vocal. Here, you and I are old enough to remember how vocal business was in the 1980s. Not just things like the free trade debate, but going into the 1990s on the sovereignty debate. A previous CEO, a great CEO of Royal Bank, Alan Taylor, spoke actively and repeatedly about national unity through the 90s and got a lot of heat for that, particularly from different parts of the country. So I think this goes in cycles or waves, and we're now seeing business leaders, not all of them, but a critical mass who are being more vocal on a growing range of issues. And I find, and I see this a little bit more in the position I'm in now, governments receive this with differing degrees of openness. Governments sometimes enjoy and like that debate, and sometimes governments say, wait a second, who are you to be speaking about this issue that's not a direct part of your business? Right.
Business is so important now, though. I think there's real hunger to know what these people and what these companies believe and what they care about.
And I think business leaders get that increasingly. And you see in survey after survey, people generally distrust institutions. And our trust in institutions, government, media, business, religious institutions is in secular decline, is rock bottom in the case of some institutions. Business is more trusted than most institutions, more trusted among more people than government. A generalization, I know, but I think business leaders are looking at that kind of data and thinking, okay, we got to fulfill a responsibility if the public trusts us on more than delivering the products and services that we deliver. We got to speak up and take positions on debatable or controversial issues.
Right. Okay, so at least people feel comfortable doing that in the Davos setting. Can we talk about a couple of things that came up there and get your sense of where things were at? We talk a lot about climate change here in the pod. I'm pretty obsessed with it as an issue. Some reports that I read from the meeting were encouraged by the extent of the talk of climate change in Davos and the seriousness of the talk about climate change in Davos. On the other hand, I saw an interview where Larry Summers was utterly dismissive of it because he said it's all virtue signaling, and none of these people are prepared to talk about eliminating subsidies to fossil fuels, and none of these people are prepared to talk about the massive investments government's going to have to make and the taxes that will be required to pay for them. So this is all just lip service. Where do you fall on that?
Yeah, I completely disagree with that. I think this is moved way beyond lip service. If you look at the material commitments that companies like Microsoft are making, we can talk about BlackRock, but it was pretty extraordinary what Satya Nadella announced coming into Davos, that Microsoft is not only going to be a net zero organization, meaning they will take as much carbon out of the atmosphere as they put in, and that includes all of us using their services. So if you're working on LinkedIn or on Outlook, which are both Microsoft products, and generating or consuming energy to do that, they're going to count that as part of their emissions, and they're going to offset that or ensure that that green energy is powering whatever you're doing. But more than being net zero, they are going to compensate for the entire history of their emissions over the 40 or 50 years of Microsoft's existence. That's a material decision that's going to cost the company significant amounts of money. Now, we can get into how this is in their long-term commercial interest. They're not doing this out of some benevolence, pure benevolence.
How is it in their long-term commercial interest?
It makes them more competitive. It makes them more sustainable. They genuinely believe, and I think this is the view of a growing number of businesses, that we're not going to thrive, maybe even survive as organizations if we don't have sustainable, not only sustainable businesses, but sustainable communities that we're serving. But there also is a growing recognition that this so-called low-carbon transition, or this energy transformation, may be the biggest economic opportunity that we're going to see in the coming decades. And organizations, and I'd argue countries or regions that get their heads around, and this is what Angela Merkel was talking about, that see this as an opportunity. This isn't a cost, to Larry Summers' point. This is not a cost. This is an investment with probably a significant return. That's very attractive, not only for the company, but for shareholders. And smart companies are now starting to lay out for the shareholders, and they can be big shareholders like BlackRock or individual shareholders, saying, here's our plan to take advantage of the energy transition that is probably going to take decades, but is underway and is going to accelerate. And the early adopters, the innovators, are going to have a above average return as a result.
Right. So those kind of business incentives, and I've heard Mark Carney talk about how investment money is increasingly flowing to low carbon intensive things and away from high carbon intensive things. Is that going to happen fast enough? It doesn't feel like it has the urgency to it that the scientists would encourage us to have.
And that was a really critical debate at Davos, and it's happening the world over, not just the direction that we're moving in, the decisions we have to be made, but the sense of urgency. Do we have 5 years, 10 years, or 50 years?
Right.
Those are critical markers, and we probably don't know we may not know till it's too late. And I think Carney would make that argument that that's not a choice you can make lightly. You're better to err on the side of urgency than to rag the puck, to use the Canadian expression. But you're seeing, and I certainly heard this at Davos, a growing, way more than interest. It is now a decision point for a lot of big investors. The BlackRock is getting all the headlines, but there's lots more like that. Pension funds, institutional investors, the big money of the world, that is saying, you got to lay out a plan on your transition. We may not be entirely off oil, or entirely, most are off coal right now, but they may be willing to invest in oil and gas companies, including Canadian companies, but there's got to be a plan that shows and measures the decline in carbon emissions starting now.
That's why the oil sands are having trouble attracting investment, right?
That is a big challenge for them and for Canadian financial institutions. This is an active conversation in Canadian financial institutions that have them as clients. So we have to explain to our investors, certainly European investors, what's our plan, what's our carbon footprint, and we're happy to do that. I think we've got a really compelling, progressive plan. Yeah. But that's the conversation that you now get in a lot of the money capitals of the world, and Canadians have got to get their heads around. I don't mean that pejoratively. Get our heads around it, but we have to understand there's different pathways to lower emissions. There's not a single pathway, but we've got to choose the paths that we're going to take and measure our progress a lot more urgently than we might be today.
And to Larry Summers' point, in addition to their own individual actions, which both contribute to helping the environment and also are good business decisions for them, which is why they're making them, in addition to those basic business incentives, do they see an important role for government and government investment and government frameworks in this climate change battle, or are they adverse to a big government approach to climate change?
I think most businesses, including in the oil and gas sector, want to do this in partnership with government, and they want to lay out a plan. to say, over the next 10 years or 20 years, here is our emissions plan. And we're going to get from here to here. And this is part of a bigger emissions commitment for the country. And we're going to need technology to do that. And there's been extraordinary developments by Canadian oil producers on the tech side to reducing emissions better than a really good range of oil producers internationally. They need to, and they want to do more of that. That's going to take, billions of dollars of science spending, which is going to come from the private sector and from governments, provincial and federal. Right. This can be our moonshot for the 2020s, just as America had a moonshot for the 1960s. And that was a public-private enterprise that actually gave birth to Silicon Valley. So there's a real opportunity here for Canada to see this as a very positive investment to make in the economy of tomorrow, which I would argue includes, for the foreseeable future, the oil and gas producers that we have today upping their game year by year, advancing their technologies and reducing their emissions.
Do you think that they are prepared, given how seriously they were taking it? Do you think they are prepared to play a public advocacy role as well? I'm thinking about the United States. I mean, nothing matters if the U.S. doesn't get more serious about climate, especially at the governmental level. Nothing matters. And, I'm in the election, I'm watching two billionaires spend hundreds of millions of dollars on advertising to promote their own candidacies. Is it possible we would see anything like that to convince Americans of the need to move on climate change?
Americans by the tens of millions are moving on climate change. You're seeing this at the state level, at the city level, and I'm not trying to underplay what's happening at the federal level, but Americans, American organizations, American scientists are doing a lot of extraordinary things. So let's not kind of throw our hands up and say, hey, the U.S. is doing nothing, we shouldn't do anything. There's a lot of great things going on in the United States that we have to connect with, take advantage of, and also sell into. Like we're developing world-class technologies across the energy spectrum in Canada that we should be scaling and selling by the billions to the Americans, to the Chinese, to whoever will buy it. Again, this is a reframing of the climate conversation for Canadians that we're really excited about, to see this as an opportunity. This is not some burden on our country. This is an opportunity for us to develop a whole new export sector, to develop new technologies, not just for our benefit, but to help other countries reduce their emissions.
Now, Canadians have heard that before, right? Wasn't that the underlying premise of the McGuinty's government's Green Energy Act? That this was a first mover advantage and this was an opportunity for Canada to be exporting solar panels all over the world?
That was part of the argument for that policy, and I don't think the McGuinty government was the first Canadian government to advocate investments in renewables or in energy technology as an export advantage, and we shouldn't give up on that opportunity.
But it hasn't materialized really to date, has it?
There's a lot of extraordinary things going on in clean tech in Canada. I'm trying to remember. There was a recent listing of the top 100 clean tech companies in the world, and I think 10 or 15 were Canadian, which, given our size, is extraordinary. So there's a lot of incredible things going on in Canadian tech. Carbon capture and sequestrations, and we've probably just lost the last remaining listeners with that expression.
Sequestration gets edited from the show, that's right.
But for those still listening, there's extraordinary things going on by private sector Canadian companies with that technology that, if they get right, is going to be a multi-billion-dollar export to the U.S., China, and other markets.
Okay. Well, you're way too optimistic, but we're going to have to take a break and hear a word from our original sponsor, the Ontario Real Estate Association. Trust. It's at the heart. By the way, while I'm doing this, you can be thinking about how exactly to play Kashmir on that drum set. Trust. It is at the heart of every successful relationship, especially when it comes to buying a home. Ontario's 80,000 realtors are trusted every day to help their clients navigate one of the largest financial transactions of their lives, buying a home. Representing Canada's realtors, the Ontario Real Estate Association is on a mission to increase trust and professionalism in Ontario's real estate industry. That means stronger rules to punish bad behavior, access to modern business tools, and better education. The Trust in Real Estate Services Act, or TRESA, delivers on that mission. TRESA is a groundbreaking piece of legislation that will make Ontario a leader in North America when it comes to real estate professionalism and trust. Go to www.orea.com to learn more. All right, we're back with John Stackhouse. And, I have to say that, because we talk about politics on this podcast.
David, it's your podcast. You don't have to say anything.
I don't know if you know, but we talk about politics on the podcast. And to watch the reception that Donald Trump got at Davos and the introduction he got from the head of Davos, given that he violates everything that they were purporting to care about and all the principles that underlie the Davos conference, he gets glowingly introduced and he's warmly received. And, I look at that, John, and I say to myself, are these people so rich now? Because the uber rich have gotten so vastly richer than they used to be in recent decades. Have these people gotten so rich that that's all they care about now, and that they're really, really just dedicated to defending what they have? I mean, how can you admire, or how can, if you listen to the way they talk, you'd think they would be Elizabeth Warren supporters, but The Guardian says really they're all Trump supporters. And where is the business community coming from? Not the business community so much as this uber-rich group of people that influence opinion at places like Davos, right? What are they rooted in now? What can we expect from them?
So I think you may be conflating some perceptions, and I'll try to sort of detangle them and then address what is a serious and important question. So Davos,
you're going to strip away all of the irrelevancies I layered in and cut to the really important question.
Klaus Schwab, the founder of Davos, who does all the center stage moderating, has been criticized fairly extensively for a kid glove treatment, not only of President Trump, but of a range of leaders over the years, over the decades. That's his style. And everyone knows that that's just the nature or even the promise of Davos. It's a safe stage. And the audience, which is much more diverse than what you're suggesting, so that's the part I wanted to address, is also interestingly polite. There's no booing or heckling at Davos. I don't know why that is. There's lots of tisking, if that's a word. It's really interesting. You sit in the audience and you hear these little sort of natterings and mutterings, but no outright booing.
Right.
At least that I've seen, and it's not just of Trump. There's all sorts of leaders up there who could be heckled, booed, jeered by good chunks of that audience. But you see climate activists and people, political leaders from the left sitting there. They don't applaud. And it's worth noting that the applause for Trump after his speech was very muted and limited. And that was noted, but there isn't outright heckling. So that's just the nature of the place. The Davos crowd, again, a generalization, but I think is not wildly in favor of Trump. There are business leaders, especially from the United States, who are supporters of Trump, and certainly Republicans, and they were speaking out positively and supportively of his economic policies. But there's a lot of business leaders from different parts of the world, as well as the United States. You have people like Tim Cook from Apple there, who's hardly been a Trump pom-pom waver, right. Who speak more quietly or in private sessions, sharing their concerns. You get more robust debates in private. You also get, go back to Merkel's speech, which was very critical of Trump, not by name, but you didn't need a degree in political science to listen to her taking one shot after another at his international policies, from Iran to NATO to Europe to climate.
Right. Okay. Fans of Trump's economic policies and the general sense that the world economy is strong. I just have to ask you, because you were covering politics in the 1990s and 80s. What happened to deficits?
What happened to them? They're everywhere. It's interesting that.
Can the U.S. stimulate like this indefinitely?
So we'll hit $1 trillion this year, and it's extraordinary. It's one of the most extraordinary parts of Davos, which is the World Economic Forum, that there was not much of a debate, and there hasn't been for years there, to my knowledge, about fiscal prudence. You don't hear those words a whole lot at Davos. So even among what's arguably an economically conservative group with varying degrees of liberal, small liberal leanings, not a lot of fiscal debate. Genuine concern and debate about stimulus, about secular stagnation. You hear that certainly from the Europeans.
Right.
And the challenges of getting through the 2020s if growth rates continue as they have been and demographics continue, especially in the West, as they are. There's interesting challenges ahead. And that's going to create a lot more pressure on governments on the fiscal side to stimulate. So again, at risk of losing those remaining listeners, we're at a really important crossroads where we've used monetary policy pretty as much as we can. Interest rates close to zero. We cannot go into into negative interest rates. That's bad outcomes all around. So the pressure is going to grow on the fiscal side if we don't have more private sector-led growth.
So does that mean the 80s and 90s were all bullshit? The restraint of the 80s and 90s and the sacrifices people made to balance budgets?
No, because inflation. So go back to the beginning of the 80s and sort of the underlying conditions. Rampant inflation, high interest rates. We remember 18% interest rates. I mean, that's, God help us, we never see that again. So a need to turn the heat up on the monetary side in ways that are rare in history. That led to a compounding of debts and deficits in the public sector, where we had just borrowed so much and we're paying 10+% interest. Governments were paying that on well-rated bonds. That was completely unsustainable. So the 90s was a reckoning and a kind of reordering of public finance to get us back to kind of a normalization. And that led to many years of decent growth going into the 2000s, bumps with 9/11 and then the financial crisis. But generally the outcome of those adjustments in the 90s were positive across the economy. So I would say that was not for nothing at all. It was actually very positive. Now we're into a new part of a cycle, maybe into a new cycle altogether, which Larry Summers would call secular stagnation, where we've got an older economy, a lower growth economy, and we're not seeing innovation in the economy and productivity gains like we did going back to the 60s and 70s.
Right.
And that is to me the real riddle of the economy. It's not should governments borrow more, run bigger deficits to stimulate. There's an argument for that. That's not a good option. It may be the option that
why not? If I could just stop you. If the United States can run $1 trillion, why shouldn't we be running $100 billion?
Okay, so let's get back to that. But the key need in the economy is for the private sector to innovate, to create new sectors, new products, new companies, to generate growth. And then governments can draw revenue from that and provide services. That's when we get into a positive cycle and start to get back to kind of more sustainable growth in the 2, maybe 3% range over the long term. The question you're asking is almost existential for us. It's the bit of moral hazard there. But yeah, what do we do when the U.S. is just like borrowing like mad? We have to bear in mind the U.S. economy is massive. So even like $1 trillion, which sounds just like beyond our comprehension as Canadians, is in some ways manageable in a strong growing U.S. economy. But there's a lot of structural issues that Americans have to come to grips with, just in their own spending, with so-called entitlements. They've built in, and given their demographics, are going to be a real challenge through the 20s. Their challenge on the revenue side of their tax structure is probably not ideal. Some would argue it's not sustainable. So
right.
they've got some reckoning to do both on the spending and the taxation side. I don't think that gives us permission just to sit by and do nothing or borrow wildly because, hey, you know, our neighbors burning down their forest, let's burn ours down too. That's not healthy for our economy. Governments from time to time or through different parts of the cycle should be borrowing and stimulating. We have to be careful that governments aren't doing that when the private sector and consumers are doing that. We also have to be careful of the burden of debt across society. And right now, and Bill Morneau spoke about this at Davos, our public sector finances in Canada are generally okay. You know, no one's burning their hair because of levels aggregate.
It's the personal debt.
It's the personal debt. Corporate debt is manageable as long as the economy is growing. Personal debt is...
That's why interest rates can never go up.
Is okay as long as interest rates don't go up and the economy is growing.
Right.
If people have a job, they're getting by, but that is not a good approach to an economy. So at present, and a lot of work is going on this, but we need to think about how to bring down that personal debt a little more manageably, how to ensure that people are investing, not just borrowing and spending, and that the investing is in productive assets for the economy.
People are borrowing because they're not making enough money to keep up to the standard of living that they want.
Okay, so you've just thrown two variables in because they don't have enough money and then to get up to the standard of living that they want. So we've got two...
That they think they should have at this stage of their life in Canada.
Yes, and we have all sorts of opportunities to spend that are new or different, and then there's generational expectations, and then there's particular pressures on things like housing, which is obviously a growing challenge for Canada. The cost of housing is unsustainable in parts of the country for a good percentage of the population, especially younger Canadians who are trying to get into the housing market.
And you know, if people don't own a home or think they'll ever own their home, they don't think they're middle class. They think they're something less than middle class. And they think they have something less than a full stake in society. It's a big deal.
Yeah.
Right. Another big topic. Davos joined a conversation that seems to be burgeoning in the business community, which is reshaping capitalism and trying to make a softer, kinder, gentler version of capitalism that is less 100% focused on shareholder value and more focused on either shared value or stakeholder value or however you want to describe it. When people in Davos talk about reshaping capitalism, what are they trying to address? What do they mean by that?
So it's not softer, kinder, gentler, although maybe it becomes that. That's not what's driving so-called stakeholder capitalism. Stakeholder capitalism, this new capitalism or capitalism reimagined, or repurposed, I should say, is a view among a growing number of business leaders and shareholders, investors, that a business thrives when it is ensuring that all of its so-called stakeholders, clients, customers, employees, suppliers, the communities that they exist in, are prospering. Your business will do better if you are in different ways ensuring the prosperity of those stakeholders and not just your shareholder. The Milton Friedman approach to capitalism is the business of business is business. your only return, just focus on delivering a return to your shareholder. Governments will tax you and take care of everything else. That doesn't work in a 21st century economy. We can debate whether it worked in a 20th century economy.
Right.
But businesses, and I think the majority of people out there, of citizens, see the need for business to be a more active player in communities, not for some feel-good PR reason, but to ensure that there is this prosperity in their communities, that their customers, their employees, their suppliers are all thriving. A business's chances of thriving go up. And smart shareholders are demanding that. The BlackRocks of the world know that their returns, especially longer-term returns, are going to go up if they invest in businesses that have that more holistic view.
So when Michael McCain was on the podcast, he talked pretty persuasively about how critical it is, how limited companies can be virtuous on their own before competitive pressures kick the slats out from under them, and how really what you need is rules that govern everybody who's in the competitive landscape, and then you can have whatever wages, whatever costs on business you want, but you can't be a first mover particularly.
It helps to have guardrails.
Other than things that also have a business interest to them. But
it helps to have guardrails so that your competitors are not able to do things recklessly or irresponsibly that put you at a disadvantage. But I think in many sectors, there is a competitive advantage to being, I don't know if it's the first mover, but certainly being an innovator in that space. It is really important for getting good long-term shareholders. You'll find if you are an international organization talking to big institutional investors around the world, they want to know about your purpose, about your approach to communities, because that will affect their investing decisions. It's becoming really critical for hiring. If you're trying to hire, and I don't want to generalize here about millennials, because I think this is true across generations, but if you're trying to hire today, and that's a big challenge for pretty much every business, you better have a compelling view of your purpose, why you exist as a business, if you want to get the best employees out there, the best talent out there. And it's becoming increasingly important for customers. People are deciding what to buy, not of everything, but for a lot of products and services based on the values of the organization that's creating those products.
Those are the people that can afford to use their wallet that way. Most people are pretty constrained price-wise by how much virtue they can show. But okay, let's have a tangible example. Why was the Ontario business community monolithic in its opposition to the raising of the minimum wage a couple of years ago, when frankly there's tons of empirical evidence that it doesn't have a catastrophic economic effect, and it would obviously increase the welfare of the communities in which they're operating in? 30% of Ontarians got a raise when the minimum wage went up. That's how many people are working below $14 an hour in Ontario. Yet, that was an area where the business community was implacably opposed to that.
Well, I would take issue with the word implacable and the other word of monolithic, but there was acute concern at that point in time, given the state of the economy, given the state of investment flows across the border, and the jurisdictional challenge for a lot of Ontario employers that are having to compete with Indiana or Ohio. And it's not just labor.
Hence McCain's point.
It's not just labor.
That's exactly Michael's point.
It's not just labor costs, it's electricity costs, it's other factors. And we have a lot of advantages like healthcare, but you put all this together, if you're running a factory or an operation in Ontario and you're faced with that kind of forced cost increase, that may be the last straw when your main competitor has a whole host of other advantages against you. That's why I use that word guardrails. And we can get into the challenges across border competition, and this is going to become a really interesting challenge on climate issues. where we've got to be careful that we aren't way out of balance with what's going on in the U.S. But I think there's an opportunity through a different approach through USMCA to sort of how the North American economy evolves to ensure that it is an advantage for Canada. But I think you'll find business doesn't isolate particular issues the way you're presenting it. It's part of a basket of costs or burdens, depending on your perspective, on an operator, including regulation.
Okay. But I'm just trying to reconcile this. Our communities have to be prosperous. Our employees have to be prosperous. I don't want to pay anybody $14 an hour.
I think you would have a different response to that from different employers.
Right. Such as?
I think there's a good range of Canadian employers who want to and do pay their employees more than they might have to. I think there's a good range of Canadian employers who would say, let's say $14 an hour or $15 an hour actually is a good wage for certain people at certain ages and stages of life or for what they're doing. So let's not have a sweeping generalization of the labor force.
Right, but there's a lot more people than just students making some part-time money earning minimum wage now. I mean, this is a common circumstance for people. Anyway, I don't want to dwell on the minimum wage thing. I'm just trying to understand how the rubber hits the road here for real people, how this comes down from this lofty understanding that capitalism isn't really working for a lot of people, and maybe it's not on a sustainable trajectory. How does that get distilled down to anything that matters to an actual working person in Canada?
I think a growing number of organizations, businesses, employers in Canada, and certainly internationally, are looking at what's called the fourth industrial revolution, at this waves of technology that are transforming, smart technologies that are automating jobs, that are displacing people, that are creating new opportunities, more new opportunities than they're eliminating, but presents some really big challenges for us.
Not to the same people, presumably.
Sorry?
Not to the same people, presumably.
No, but this is part of it, and this is something we're deeply engaged in is the skills transformation, and we see a huge opportunity and a need for business to help lead that conversation. We can't leave it just to government or just to colleges and universities. We have to be in this. We are in this together. The challenge for most employers is to ensure that their employees, and everyone is squeezed for talent these days, have the skills to take advantage of these new technologies. And the smart ones are investing in training, are recruiting and trying to retain as best as they can people who can work with new technologies. Our challenge is how to help people, or among our challenges is how to help people who don't have those skills and are maybe at a stage in life where they may not have the aptitude or the opportunities to develop new skills. But we're in a labor shortage environment, and that's probably not going to change given demographics. So we have to get a lot more creative, nimble, frankly ambitious with how we help people develop the skills that are going to make them even more relevant in the 20s and 30s.
Do we have to look at it that way? Do we have to say, okay, now you've got to become equally useful at something else? If you accept the fact that over the next 20 years, automated driving is going to eliminate every job driving a vehicle in Canada. Truck drivers and taxi drivers are, not all going to get retrained to be whatever works in the new AI economy. But surely we learned this.
Why not?
Surely we learned this.
Why not? Technology always creates more jobs than it eliminates.
But
We've
not
seen
for
this
the
over
same
hundreds.
people. And I'm just saying, we learned this in the free trade thing where we left a whole swath of people behind who got massive free trade in aggregate increased the wealth of our countries, but it devastated certain people. We didn't pay sufficient attention to them. And in my view, that's now why we have Trump and Brexit and these kinds of things happening. So surely we're not going to make that same mistake. We're going to have some sort of cushion for people that are displaced by AI.
And that is the argument for the retraining initiatives that we've been part of and are encouraging every employer to be part of. Coming back to Davos, something, a very tangible thing that came out of Davos last week was a commitment among businesses and governments around the world to creating 1 billion retraining opportunities over the course of the 2020s. That's going to be measured. That's going to be studied so that we're learning from each other. That's not sufficient by any means, but it's an important illustration of what happens when business and government and community leaders sit down and talk about these very challenges and then see what other countries are doing. In Canada, and we've been active in the conversation with provincial and federal governments about how to advance our ability to train and retrain. We're learning from European countries. We're learning from American states that some of them are really advanced on this front, learning from Asian countries. So that's where Davos plays a really, really positive role. But back to the point of taxi drivers, I wouldn't give up and say, hey, we just need to create a better welfare net for them. We are going to need
basic income, yes or no?
No.
Okay.
For economic as well as moral reasons.
Yeah.
I think economically, there's no evidence that it works. Morally, and Yuval Harari, the author of *Sapiens*, spoke at Davos and gave a really compelling speech.
He finished me off. I was a pessimist before I read that book, and now I'm absolutely a fatalist. Like, I'm just, forget about it. We are a bad animal that does bad things.
And he talked about, even to erase any degree of optimism that you might have, David, he talked about the emergence of the useless class and this point that I think you were getting to, that there's going to be lots of people displaced by technology. And the biggest risk to society may be the sense of irrelevance. And when humans feel irrelevant, that's part of our species, that's part of our makeup, we do bad things.
Right.
And this isn't just an economic conversation, it's a moral conversation. How do you ensure people have relevance in their society, that they're not just sitting at home collecting a basic income check or whatever means we create? I think that's a really important challenge for us. But I think we're going to need more people in new jobs that are being created than we've got, and we've got to get much more ambitious with helping those. If you want to use the case of taxi drivers, helping them develop the skills and not do it overnight. This is going to take years, so let's get on with it now, so that by 2025, 2030, they've got the aptitudes to take on whatever entrepreneurs are creating between now and then.
Okay, despite having heard that talk from the author of *Sapiens*, you are an optimist. You sound like an optimist. You've always been an optimistic person. You still sound optimistic about all the things we've been talking about. Why are you optimistic?
I'm an Oakland Raiders fan.
Well,
without optimism, there's nothing.
No franchise had a shittier end than that. What team's more identified with its town than Oakland? It's appalling that they've moved.
It's appalling.
Right. But anyway, why are you optimistic?
Human ingenuity. I love Harari's work, but I disagree that we are a cursed species. I think we are a creative and ultimately cooperative species, despite some of our darker nature. We create, we build, we progress. That's what humans do, and we have to remind ourselves that we're generally quite good at that. We generally make the world better, even though we do lots of harm to the world. And we've got epic challenges before us, climate change being the biggest. We have to ensure that we are using that human ingenuity, that human sense of cooperation to create and innovate our way through this challenge. And that's what humans do.
And to do that, we need to rise above self-interest, though, all sectors of us, right? And like this is my thing about climate change. I mean, people have to understand this for the monumental war-like challenge, mobilization that it requires, right? And as long as everything's sort of siloed in self-interest, that won't work.
Absolutely, and this is where business can play a really constructive role of bringing people together. Governments are challenged by all sorts of forces. It's a very difficult environment to be in government today, regardless of your party. And this is all the more reason for business to be engaged in these conversations, to look beyond the immediate interests of an individual business and to understand that we have to build and continue to build an economy and communities that are going to be stronger, more resilient in 2030 than they are in 2020. And we're not going to do that on our own. That's got to be business working with governments, with schools, with academic institutions, with scientists, with youth, with a new generation that can build a better future.
Right. You've got a fourth book coming out in April?
I do.
What's it about?
It's called Planet Canada, and it is about Canada's secret weapon, which is our own diaspora. It's the 2 to 3 million Canadians living and working around the world who are extraordinary people, proudly Canadian, and we are maybe the only country in the world that does not have a strategy for its global population. And as we shrink, just by basic math in terms of our presence in the world, as our percentage of everything in the world, that population is going to be incredibly important to developing Canada's interests and ensuring that the world develops in the ways that Canadians would want to see. And I was able to meet and talk to Canadians, some of them you know who are well known, but the vast majority who you've probably never heard of, who are doing extraordinary things from architecture in China to business in the Middle East to human rights work in Europe and Africa, doing extraordinary things for the world. They're so proud to be Canadian, and we need to ensure that we're helping them, but connecting with them much more strategically than we are.
Cool. Interesting. John, thanks for coming on.
It's a real pleasure.
Was really interesting. It was great. Great. And after you edited me for many years at the Globe and Mail, it's great to have the reverse seat here and be the one asking you questions.
This is revenge. Thank you,
anyway,
David. I love your show.
interesting. Thanks. And I want to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, for their support of this podcast. I also want to thank our original sponsor, the Ontario Real Estate Association. I want to thank everybody for listening. I want to thank Andy for the video. I want to thank Spencer for the recording of this thing. And I also want to remind you that next week you might be expecting a Scott and Jenny panel, a burn before reading or whatever we're going to call it, panel to be coming up, but you're going to be denied because next week is a special episode of the Herle Burly in which we're going to have 5 of the 6 Ontario Liberal leadership candidates in the studio here, in the Orange Lounge, in the round, and we're going to have a far more vigorous and enlightening debate than what has been going on so far about who these people are, what makes them tick, and why exactly Stephen Del Duca should not be the leader of the Ontario Liberal Party. So tune in next week for the Ontario Liberal leadership debate.